What happens when the most stubborn species in the galaxy finally stops arguing and simply says, fine, we accept? When humanity's endless debates, negotiations, and complaints suddenly fall silent, every alien civilization knows something terrifying is about to unfold. Because when humans stop talking, they start doing. And what they do next will reshape the balance of power across 1,000 worlds. This is the story of how two simple words from Earth sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council, how ancient alien empires trembled at humanity's quiet acceptance, and how the universe learned that sometimes the most dangerous response isn't defiance, it's agreement. The silence stretched across the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council like a disease. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat perfectly still in the human delegation's modest seat, her hands folded neatly on the polished table before her. Around her, representatives from 347 different species shifted uncomfortably, their various appendages twitching with nervous energy. The Zektar High Counselor's 6 eyes blinked in rapid succession, a clear sign of agitation among his species. His crystalline voice cracked slightly as he repeated his question. Ambassador Vasquez, did you just say fine? We accept? Elena's smile was small and serene. Yes, High Counselor Reshmerich. Humanity accepts the Council's proposal in its entirety. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembly. The Velthari representative's tentacles writhed anxiously, while the insectoid Crixel delegate began the rapid clicking that indicated extreme distress in their species. Even the normally stoic granite lords shifted their massive stone forms uneasily. High Counselor Reshmerich's primary eye stalks swiveled to focus entirely on the human ambassador. In the 1,000 cycles since the Galactic Council's formation, they had learned to expect certain things from humanity. Endless debate, passionate arguments, detailed counterproposals that stretched for hundreds of pages, dramatic speeches about freedom and dignity and the indomitable human spirit. They had never expected simple acceptance. Perhaps, Reshmerich said carefully, you require time to review the terms more thoroughly. The proposal is quite comprehensive. Elena's smile didn't waver. We've reviewed it extensively. The systematic relocation of human colonies from disputed sectors, the reduction of Earth's voting rights in the Council, the mandatory sharing of all human military technology with the Enforcement Armada, the installation of Council monitors on every human world. We understand completely. The Saurian delegate, whose species had fought 3 brutal wars with humanity over mining rights, leaned forward in his chair. His forked tongue flicked out nervously. This is highly irregular. Where are your usual protests? Your demands for amendments? There are none, Elena replied simply. As I said, we accept. The whispered conversations that erupted across the hall carried an undercurrent of fear that even the universal translators couldn't fully mask. The Aquatic Federation's representative spoke through his breathing apparatus in rapid, bubbling tones that translated as barely controlled panic. This cannot be genuine acceptance. Humans always fight, always argue. It is their nature. Elena finally stood, her movement smooth and deliberate. She was unremarkable by human standards. Average height, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing the standard diplomatic uniform of dark blue with minimal ornamentation. But every eye in the vast chamber fixed on her as she spoke. You're absolutely right, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic systems. We do always fight. We argue about everything. We debate the color of water and the shape of circles. We question authority so instinctively that our children ask, why before they can properly walk? She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled representatives. Which is why I want to make sure you all understand exactly what you're asking for. You want us to stop fighting. Stop questioning. Stop being difficult. The ethereal collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline matrix, pulsed with colors that indicated deep concern. Ambassador, we simply seek order. Stability. Your species' tendency toward chaos disrupts the careful balance we have maintained for millennia. Chaos, Elena repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose that's one way to look at it. When we questioned the Velthari's claim that their religion required exclusive access to the Kepler systems, that was chaos. When we refused to accept the Granite Lord's assertion that smaller species should naturally serve larger ones, that was disruptive. When we insisted on investigating the mysterious disappearances of ships in Saurian space, that certainly upset the balance. Each species she mentioned shifted uncomfortably. The Velthari's tentacles curled tighter around their ceremonial staff. The Granite Lord's representative, a being easily 10 feet tall and carved from living rock, somehow managed to look smaller. The Saurian delegate's nictitating membranes flicked across his eyes repeatedly. But, you're right, Elena continued. We are disruptive. We do upset balances. So when the council unanimously voted to implement these measures, we had a choice. We could fight, as we always have. We could spend years in legal challenges, diplomatic protests, and public campaigns. We could make your lives miserable with our stubborn, chaotic human nature. She sat back down, that small smile returning to her face. Or we could do exactly what you've asked us to do. We could stop being disruptive. High Counselor Reshmerik's 6 eyes narrowed to pinpoints. Explain. It's quite simple, Elena said. You want predictable neighbors. Species that accept council decisions without question. Citizens who follow orders and don't rock the boat. So that's exactly what you'll get from humanity. She reached into her diplomatic case and withdrew a single data pad. As of this moment, all human colonies will begin immediate compliance with council directives. Our military will share all technological innovations with the enforcement armada. Our scientists will provide complete research data to the council archives. Our merchants will pay all taxes, fees, and tributes without complaint. The data pad landed on the table with a soft click that somehow echoed through the vast chamber. We will be the most compliant species in Galactic Council history. The silence that followed was different from before. Where earlier there had been confusion and nervousness, now there was something approaching dread. The assembled representatives looked at each other with growing unease, though few could articulate exactly why Elena's words felt more like a threat than a capitulation. The Hive Collective's drone representative spoke in their characteristic multi-harmonic voice. This is acceptable. The Council's authority must be respected. Absolutely, Elena agreed cheerfully. We'll respect it completely, starting with immediate withdrawal from all joint defense pacts. A ripple of alarm went through the chamber. The Velthari representative's tentacles snapped to full extension. Withdrawal? That wasn't part of the proposal. Oh, but it was, Elena said, consulting her data pad. Section 47, subsection C clearly states that human military technology and strategic planning must be shared with the enforcement armada. As compliant council members, we certainly can't maintain separate military arrangements that might conflict with council authority. That would be disruptive. The Saurian delegate half rose from his seat. The mining consortium agreements will be terminated immediately, Elena finished. Section 23 requires council oversight of all human economic activities. Private agreements between species would undermine that oversight. We wouldn't want to be non-compliant. The Ethereal Collective's representative pulsed bright red, a color that translated roughly to extreme alarm in their emotional spectrum. The research partnerships with the Academic Union dissolved as of this morning, Elena said pleasantly. All human research must be shared with the council archives. We can't have competing data streams. That would be chaotic. High Counselor Reshmerik's voice rose to a pitch that made several species wince. These are not the intended consequences of the proposal. Elena's expression was one of innocent confusion. I'm sorry, High Counselor, but I don't understand. The proposal specifically requires human compliance with council authority. Are you suggesting we should be selective in our compliance? That we should argue about the details and try to find loopholes? The silence stretched again, but this time it carried a different quality. The assembled representatives were beginning to realize what they had unleashed. For centuries, they had dealt with a humanity that fought every decision, questioned every rule, and demanded explanations for every policy. It had been exhausting, frustrating, and often infuriating. But it had also been predictable. The Aquatic Federation's representative was the first to understand the implications. Water bubbled frantically through his speaking apparatus as he tried to form words. The trade routes. Your merchant marine provides security for 70% of civilian shipping. Did provide security, Elena corrected gently. As of this morning, all human vessels have been recalled to Council-approved patrol routes only. We couldn't possibly maintain the irregular scheduling and independent decision-making that effective merchant escort requires. That would be far too chaotic. The Crixal delegates' clicking reached fever pitch. Their species communicated partially through sound, and the pattern they were producing translated roughly to impending catastrophe in most languages. The agricultural subsidies from your colonies, many worlds depend on human food shipments, were indeed irregular and economically disruptive, Elena agreed. Giving away food at below-market prices undermines proper economic planning. As compliant council members, we're implementing proper market rate pricing for all agricultural exports, effective immediately. One by one, the representatives began to understand. The Velthari's lucrative mining operations in the Kepler systems depended on human security forces to keep the shipping lanes clear. The Saurian trade empire relied on human merchants who were willing to take risks other species avoided. The academic union's greatest discoveries had come from joint research projects where human scientists asked uncomfortable questions that other species politely ignored. The Granite Lord's representative spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The prison transport contracts, canceled, Elena said simply. We've released all non-human prisoners back to their respective governments. Managing criminals from other species is a level of authority we're not qualified to exercise under council oversight. The chamber erupted in panicked voices as the implications continued to cascade. Hundreds of small agreements, informal arrangements, and traditional courtesies that had kept the galactic economy functioning were being systematically dismantled, not through rebellion or defiance, but through absolute, literal compliance with the council's demands. High Counselor Reshmerich slammed all four of his hands on the council platform, the sound echoing like gunshots. This is not what was intended. Elena looked up at him with genuine surprise. High Counselor, I don't understand. Are you asking humanity to be non-compliant with council directives? Because that sounds remarkably like you want us to go back to our old, disruptive ways. The trap was perfect and complete. For months, the council had painted human behavior as chaotic and destructive. They had demanded compliance, order, and submission to proper authority. Now they had it. And they were discovering that the chaos they had complained about was actually a carefully managed flexibility that held their civilization together. The ethereal collective pulsed through a rapid spectrum of colors before settling on a deep purple that indicated profound regret. Perhaps the proposal could be amended. Oh no, Elena said, shaking her head firmly. The council voted unanimously. To change course now would suggest that the council's decisions aren't final and absolute. That would be terribly disruptive to proper order. She stood again, gathering her data pad with practiced efficiency. Unless the council is officially asking humanity to return to our previous, chaotic behavior, I want to be very clear about what you're requesting. The silence was absolute now. Every representative in the chamber understood that they were balanced on the edge of a precipice. They could maintain their position and watch their civilization slowly strangle itself on rigid compliance, or they could admit that humanity's chaos had been essential to making their system work. Either choice would mean acknowledging that they had been wrong. And for species that had spent millennia believing in their own superiority over the newest members of their galactic community, that acknowledgement carried a price they weren't sure they were willing to pay. Elena waited patiently, her small smile never wavering, as the greatest powers in the galaxy struggled with the realization that they needed the very thing they had tried to destroy. The emergency session convened exactly 72 hours after humanity's acceptance, though it felt like centuries to those assembled in the council's private chambers. Unlike the grand public hall where formal sessions took place, this room was smaller, more intimate, and far more tense. The curved walls displayed real-time data streams from across the galaxy, and every single indicator was flashing red. High Counselor Reshmerich had not slept since the session ended. His 6 eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, and his normally pristine robes were wrinkled from 3 days of constant wear. Around the table sat the 12 most powerful beings in known space, and every one of them looked like they had aged years in the past few days. Status report, Reshmerich croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The Veltheri representative, whose name was Zalandra and whose tentacles now hung limp with exhaustion, consulted her data tablet with shaking appendages. The Kepler mining operation has shut down completely. Without human security forces, the shipping lanes are too dangerous for civilian transport. Pirates have already struck 3 convoys. She paused, tentacles curling with distress. Production is down 94%. If this continues for another week, we'll lose the entire operation. The Saurian delegate, General Kethvar, was normally one of the most aggressive voices on the council. Now he seemed almost deflated. It's worse in the outer territories. Human merchants handled 80% of all inter-system trade in the frontier sectors. They were the only ones willing to take the risks. He gestured to his own data display, which showed shipping routes across Saurian space. Where once there had been thousands of active trade lines, now only a few dozen remained operational. Our economy is collapsing. Food shortages are already being reported on 17 worlds. The crystalline being representing the Silicon Collective chimed in with harmonics that translated as barely controlled panic. The research facilities on Vega Prime have gone completely dark. Human scientists were involved in 60% of all active projects. The remaining researchers don't know how to operate most of the equipment. Because humans built most of it, rumbled the Granite Lord representative, whose species typically spoke very little, but whose words always carried weight. Their engineering solutions never followed proper protocols. Too innovative. Too flexible. The word flexible hung in the air like an accusation. For centuries, they had criticized human engineering for being unpredictable, non-standard, and difficult to replicate. Now they were learning that those same qualities had made human technology uniquely effective at solving problems other species couldn't handle. Admiral Vorthe K of the Enforcement Armada was perhaps in the worst position of all. His insectoid features were rigid with stress as he delivered his report. Military situation is critical. Human vessels provided rapid response capability for 70% of our patrol sectors. Without them, response times have increased by 400%. He clicked his mandibles nervously. 3 separate pirate fleets have already launched major operations. The Crimson Nebula raiders hit 4 shipping convoys yesterday alone. We can't respond fast enough to stop them. And the shared technology? Asked the ethereal collective representative, whose energy matrix was pulsing with very dim, worried colors. Admiral Vortheke's mandibles clicked faster. They shared everything. Exactly as requested. Complete technical specifications, manufacturing procedures, tactical doctrines, all of it. Then, why haven't you implemented it? The Admiral's compound eyes fixed on the table. Because we don't understand how it works. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Finally, Reshmerich spoke. Explain. Human technology is unique, Admiral Vortheke said carefully. Their systems are designed to be operated by beings who think like humans. Their tactical doctrines assume commanders who will ignore orders when circumstances change. Their equipment requires operators who will modify it in the field without authorization. He gestured helplessly. We've spent generations training our personnel to follow proper procedures and maintain discipline. Human military effectiveness depends on doing exactly the opposite. The Hive Collective's drone representative spoke in their characteristic multitonal voice. This cannot be accurate. Proper military organization requires hierarchy and obedience. Yes, Admiral Vortheke agreed. That's what we believed. But human units consistently outperform equivalent forces from other species by significant margins. We thought it was their technology, but the technology is useless without human operational doctrine. And human operational doctrine is. Reshmerich prompted. Controlled chaos, the Admiral admitted. They trained their personnel to think independently, question orders, and improvise solutions. It shouldn't work, but it does. Dr. Ninera from the Medical Council had been quietly reviewing her own reports, but now she looked up with an expression that conveyed deep concern across species lines. The medical situation is becoming serious. Human hospital ships provided emergency care for remote colonies across 47 star systems. She manipulated her data display, showing casualty statistics. Mortality rates in frontier sectors have increased by 340% in just 3 days. Human medical teams were the only ones willing to work in high-risk areas. Surely our own medical personnel can replace them, suggested the academic union representative. Dr. Nainera's head tentacles writhed with negative emphasis. Human medical training is completely different from ours. They're taught to make treatment decisions with incomplete information, to improvise procedures, and to keep trying even when protocols say a case is hopeless. She pulled up a specific case file. Yesterday, a mining accident on Proxima 7 trapped 47 workers underground. The local medical team followed proper procedures and declared the situation too risky for rescue operations. A human medical team would have ignored protocols and found a way to save them. How many survived? Asked Reshmerich quietly. None. The weight of that single word settled over the chamber like a shroud. They were beginning to understand that humanity's refusal to follow proper procedures wasn't just annoying bureaucratic defiance. It was often the difference between life and death. The economic coordinator, an Aquatic Federation member whose breathing apparatus bubbled constantly, finally spoke up. The economic modeling is clear. At current rates of decline, we're looking at complete systemic collapse within 6 standard months. Her webbed fingers manipulated holographic charts that showed trade volumes, resource flows, and economic indicators all trending sharply downward. Human economic behavior violated every principle of rational market theory. They consistently acted against their own short-term interests. Examples? Reshmerich asked. They provided food aid to disaster areas at a loss. They maintained trade routes to marginal colonies that weren't profitable. They invested in research projects with no immediate commercial applications. The coordinator's gills fluttered with agitation. None of it made economic sense. But it kept the system stable, observed the Granite Lord representative. Their irrational generosity prevented famines, rebellions, and economic collapses that would have cost far more to address through official channels. The room fell silent again as that observation sank in. The humans hadn't just been breaking economic rules. They had been preventing the kind of catastrophic failures that formal economic systems couldn't handle. There's something else, said Zelendra quietly. The Velthari representative's tentacles were coiled tight with stress. The prison releases. Every being in the room turned to look at her. The release of human-held prisoners had seemed like a minor administrative matter compared to the economic and military crises they were facing. The humans were holding approximately 47,000 criminals from various species, she continued. We assumed they were simply running prisons for profit or political leverage. They weren't. Reshmerich asked. The criminals they were holding were ones that other species couldn't handle. Political prisoners who were too dangerous to keep, but too valuable to execute. War criminals that would cause diplomatic incidents if properly prosecuted. Pirates and smugglers who had information that made them useful. Her tentacles trembled. Every single one of those prisoners had been formally requested by their home governments for humanitarian release or diplomatic transfer at some point. The humans ignored those requests and kept them locked up. And now, 17 governments have formally complained about the return of prisoners they can't handle. The Crimson Nebula pirates I mentioned earlier, their leader was among the released criminals. He's now using inside information about shipping schedules to plan his attacks. The implications were staggering. Humanity had been quietly managing problems that other species couldn't or wouldn't deal with properly. They had been the galactic community's unofficial troubleshooters, handling the messy situations that formal diplomacy couldn't address. High Counselor Reshmerich looked around the table at his fellow council members. In their faces, or the equivalent expressions for non-humanoid species, he could see the same realization dawning that had been growing in his own mind. They had made a terrible mistake. Options? He asked simply. We could rescind the proposal, suggested the academic union representative. Admit that the human compliance model isn't working and return to the previous arrangement. Admiral Vorthake's mandibles clicked negatively. Too late. The humans have already restructured their entire governmental and military organization around compliance. They've disbanded their independent command structures and integrated everything into council oversight systems. Then, they can't simply return to their previous behavior? Dr. Nainera asked. Not without essentially rebuilding their civilization from scratch, the Admiral confirmed. And There's no guarantee they would be willing to do so. We essentially forced them to choose between defiance and compliance. They chose compliance. To ask them to become defiant again would be admitting that defiance was the correct choice all along, finished the ethereal collective representative. The political implications were clear. For the Council to openly request that humanity return to their previous disruptive behavior would be an admission that their fundamental understanding of proper governance had been wrong. It would undermine the authority structure that held the galactic community together. But the alternative was watching their civilization slowly collapse under the weight of its own rigid efficiency. There is another option, said the Granite Lord representative slowly. We could modify our interpretation of the proposal. Reshmerik's eyes focused sharply. Explain. The proposal requires human compliance with Council directives. It doesn't specify that compliance must be absolute or literal. We could issue new directives that require creative interpretation. It was a face-saving solution, but everyone in the room knew how fragile it was. They would be asking humanity to be strategically non-compliant while maintaining the fiction that they were following orders. It was exactly the kind of diplomatic doublespeak that humans typically refuse to engage with. Will they agree to such an arrangement? Asked Zelandra. That was the question none of them could answer. They had pushed humanity into a corner, and humanity had responded by giving them exactly what they had asked for. Whether the humans would be willing to help them escape from the consequences of their own demands remained to be seen. There's only one way to find out, Reshmerik said finally. Summon Ambassador Vasquez. Elena Vasquez arrived at the emergency session exactly 15 minutes after being summoned, which was both perfectly punctual and somehow unsettling to the assembled council members. Her appearance was as unremarkable as always. The same simple diplomatic uniform, the same neat hairstyle, the same calm demeanor that had become increasingly unnerving over the past few days. She took her seat at the smaller table with practiced efficiency and folded her hands in exactly the same position she had maintained during the original session. The gesture was so precise it seemed almost rehearsed, though everyone present knew it wasn't. Good afternoon, High Counselor, she said pleasantly. How may humanity serve the Council today? The phrase, serve the Council, carried implications that made several representatives shift uncomfortably. In all their previous dealings, humans had never positioned themselves as servants. They had been partners, sometimes difficult ones, but never subordinates. High Counselor Reshmerik's 6 eyes studied the human ambassador carefully. In the 72 hours since their last meeting, he had reviewed every interaction the Council had ever had with humanity, searching for some clue to their current behavior. What he had found was a pattern he had somehow missed before. Humans were extraordinarily responsive to how they were treated. When approached as equals, they were innovative partners who contributed far more than their formal obligations required. When treated as problems to be managed, they became exactly the kind of problems they were accused of being. And when treated as subordinates, they became subordinates. Perfectly compliant, absolutely obedient subordinates who followed every instruction to the letter. Ambassador Vasquez, Reshmerik began carefully. The Council has been reviewing the implementation of our recent directives. I hope you're satisfied with humanity's compliance, Elena replied. We've worked very hard to meet every requirement exactly as specified. There was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on exactly as specified, that suggested she was well aware of the chaos her compliance was creating. Yes, Reshmerik said slowly. Your compliance has been comprehensive. Perhaps more comprehensive than was anticipated. Elena tilted her head slightly, an expression of polite confusion crossing her features. I'm sorry, High Counselor. Are you suggesting that humanity is being too compliant with Council directives? The trap was the same one she had sprung during the original session, but now it was backed by 3 days of cascading disasters across the galaxy. To criticize humanity's compliance would be to admit that the Council's directives had been flawed. To demand changes would be to acknowledge that human non-compliance had been beneficial. Admiral Vorth AK leaned forward, his insectoid features rigid with stress. Ambassador, the military situation has become complex. The shared technology protocols are proving difficult to implement. Oh, Elena's eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. Are the technical specifications inadequate? I can have our engineers provide additional documentation. No, the specifications are complete. It's the operational doctrines that are proving problematic. Elena nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, our military personnel are available for consultation if you need help understanding how the systems work. That would require human personnel to provide guidance to Council forces, Admiral Vorthike said carefully. Such guidance might involve independent decision-making. Absolutely not, Elena replied firmly. Independent decision-making would be completely inconsistent with proper Council oversight. Our military personnel will provide only the information specifically requested in the exact format specified by Council protocols. The Admiral's mandibles clicked in frustration. What he needed was for human military advisors to take initiative, to see problems developing and address them without being asked. But such behavior would violate the very compliance standards the Council had demanded. Dr. Ninera tried a different approach. Ambassador, there are medical emergencies developing in frontier sectors that require immediate attention. Of course, Elena agreed. Human medical personnel will respond to any emergency situations as directed by Council medical authorities. The response times for official authorization are too slow, Dr. Ninera explained. Medical emergencies require immediate action. Elena's expression was sympathetic but inflexible. I understand the urgency, but proper authorization procedures exist for good reasons. It would be terribly inappropriate for human medical teams to act independently of Council oversight. Dr. Ninera's head tentacles writhed with frustration. People are dying while we wait for authorization. That is unfortunate, Elena said calmly. But unauthorized medical interventions would be a clear violation of Council authority. Surely you wouldn't ask humanity to violate proper procedures. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every being in the room understood what Elena was really asking. Were they willing to officially authorize the kind of independent action that humans were known for? And if so, why had they tried to prevent it in the first place? The economic coordinator tried her own approach. The trade disruptions are causing significant hardship across multiple systems. Yes, I've seen the reports, Elena nodded. Humanity is working diligently to ensure all trade activities comply with Council regulations. The regulations were never intended to restrict emergency aid shipments, the coordinator explained. Elena consulted her data tablet. I don't see any exceptions listed in the Council directives. Could you provide specific authorization for humanitarian aid that circumvents normal trade protocols? That would require formal Council action. Of course it would. Proper procedures must be followed. The trap was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Humanity was forcing the Council to either formally authorize the kind of flexible, independent action they had previously condemned or watch their civilization collapse under the weight of its own rigid bureaucracy. Zelandra, the Veltheri representative, made one more attempt. Ambassador, surely there's some room for creative interpretation of Council directives? Elena's smile was polite, but cold. Creative interpretation? That sounds remarkably like the kind of disruptive behavior the Council voted to eliminate. Are you asking humanity to be creatively non-compliant? The words creatively non-compliant struck the assembled representatives like physical blows. It was exactly what they wanted. Humans who would bend rules, find loopholes, and solve problems in ways that proper procedures couldn't handle. But to ask for it directly would be to admit that their fundamental approach to governance was wrong. High Counselor Reshmerick realized they had reached the moment of truth. Everything that happened next would determine whether the galactic community survived its own success in taming humanity. Ambassador Vasquez, he said slowly, I want to ask you a direct question, and I would appreciate a direct answer. Elena inclined her head politely. Of course, High Counselor. Do you believe that humanity's current behavior is in the best interests of the galactic community? For the first time since entering the chamber, Elena's composed mask slipped slightly. A flicker of something, sadness, perhaps, or disappointment, crossed her features before the diplomatic expression returned. High Counselor, she said quietly. That question implies that humanity should make independent judgments about what serves the galactic community's interests. Such judgments would require us to act without explicit Council authorization, to take initiative based on our own assessment of situations, and to sometimes ignore or bend rules when we believe doing so serves a greater good. She paused, letting the implications sink in. For centuries, humanity did exactly that. We saw problems and fixed them. We ignored bureaucratic obstacles when people needed help. We took risks that other species wouldn't take, and made sacrifices that didn't make economic sense. Her voice remained calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel in it now. The council unanimously determined that this behavior was chaotic, disruptive, and inappropriate. You demanded that we stop making independent judgments and start following proper procedures. She gestured to her data tablet. So no, High Counselor, I don't believe humanity's current behavior is in the best interests of the galactic community. But my beliefs are irrelevant. The Council has determined what behavior is appropriate for humanity, and we are providing exactly what you asked for. The silence that followed was profound and painful. Every being in the room understood that they were witnessing the death of something precious. The spirit of cooperation and mutual aid that had held their diverse galactic community together despite its differences. What would it take, Reshmerich asked finally, for humanity to return to its previous behavior? Elena's smile was sad, but genuine. That's a very interesting question, High Counselor. It suggests that humanity's previous behavior was actually beneficial, despite being chaotic and disruptive. Yes, Reshmerich said quietly. It was. And that the Council's unanimous vote to restrict that behavior was mistaken. The word hung in the air like a confession. For species that prided themselves on ancient wisdom and superior governance, admitting to such a fundamental error was almost unthinkable. Yes, Reshmerich repeated. It was mistaken. Elena nodded slowly. I appreciate your honesty, High Counselor. But you're asking humanity to rebuild everything we've spent the last 3 days dismantling. You're asking us to violate the Council directives we've just restructured our entire society to follow. We could issue new directives, Admiral Vorthike began, that contradict the previous ones. Elena interrupted. That would suggest the Council's decisions aren't final and authoritative. How could we trust that the new directives wouldn't be changed again when they become inconvenient? It was a devastating point. The Council's authority rested on the premise that their decisions were wise and final. To reverse themselves so completely and quickly would undermine that authority permanently. There must be some solution, Dr. Ninera said desperately. People are dying. Elena looked directly at her, and for a moment the diplomatic mask dropped completely. What showed through was not coldness or satisfaction, but genuine pain. Dr. Ninera, 3 days ago human medical teams were saving lives in frontier sectors without authorization because it was the right thing to do. The Council voted unanimously to stop us. Now people are dying, and you want us to ignore Council directives and save lives again because it's the right thing to do. She leaned forward slightly. Do you see the problem? You want us to follow Council authority when it's convenient and ignore it when it's not. You want us to be simultaneously obedient and independent, compliant, and disruptive. Yes, Dr. Ninero admitted. That's exactly what we want. Then, you want us to be human, Elena said simply. The words carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the chamber. They were acknowledging something that the Council had spent years denying, that humanity's unique combination of irreverence and responsibility was not a flaw to be corrected, but a crucial component of their galactic civilization. What are you proposing? Reshmerich asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a tone they had never heard from a human diplomat before. Not defiant, not argumentative, but profoundly weary. High Counselor, humanity has been trying to find its place in this galactic community for over 2 centuries. We've been told we're too aggressive, too independent, too chaotic, too disruptive. Every time we've tried to change, to be what you wanted us to be, we've been criticized for not being ourselves. She gestured around the chamber. 3 days ago, you finally got what you said you wanted. A humanity that follows orders without question, that doesn't disrupt your careful plans, that acts like every other species in the Council. And it's destroying everything, the Granite Lord representative rumbled. Yes, Elena agreed. It is. She stood up slowly, gathering her data tablet with careful precision. So now you need to decide what you actually want. Do you want partners who will challenge you, ignore your rules when necessary, and constantly push for something better? Or do you want subordinates who will follow orders and let the galaxy burn if that's what proper procedures require? We want partners, Reshmerich said immediately. Elena paused at the door, looking back at the assembled representatives. Then, stop trying to change us into something we're not. Stop punishing us for being human. And start trusting that our chaos serves a purpose. She smiled, and, for the first time in days, it carried warmth instead of cold precision. Because, High Counselor, we're very good at being human. We're just terrible at being anything else. The emergency council session reconvened 12 hours later, but this time the atmosphere was different. High Counselor Reshmerich had spent those hours in intensive private consultations with each member species, and the results of those conversations were written clearly in the exhausted faces around the table. Elena entered the chamber to find the representatives arranged differently than before. Instead of the formal hierarchical seating that typically defined council meetings, the chairs had been arranged in a rough circle. It was a small change, but one that spoke to a fundamental shift in how they were approaching this conversation. Ambassador Vasquez, Reshmerich began. The council has spent considerable time reviewing our current situation. Elena took her seat, noting the changed dynamics, but maintaining her diplomatic composure. I hope the review has been productive, High Counselor. It has been illuminating, Reshmerich replied carefully. We've come to understand that our previous approach may have been based on incomplete information. The phrase, incomplete information, was diplomatic code for we were wrong. But Elena didn't push for a more direct admission. Instead, she waited patiently for the counselor to continue. We've also come to understand, Reshmerich continued, that the current situation is unsustainable for all parties involved. Admiral Vorthake leaned forward, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. Ambassador, I need to share some intelligence that has just come to light. Elena nodded for him to continue. The pirates operating in the Kepler sectors aren't just taking advantage of reduced security, he said grimly. They're using information provided by the released prisoners to target specifically valuable shipments. They know our patrol schedules, our response times, and the locations of our weakest points. He manipulated a holographic display showing pirate activity over the past week. Red indicators marked attacks, and the pattern was disturbingly systematic. This isn't opportunistic raiding. It's coordinated warfare. I see, Elena said calmly. Have council forces been able to respond effectively? The Admiral's silence was answer enough. Elena knew, as did everyone in the room, that effective counter-piracy operations required exactly the kind of flexible, rapid response that formal military doctrine discouraged. Dr. Ninera spoke up next. The medical situation has deteriorated beyond critical. We've had 47 preventable deaths in frontier sectors over the past 3 days. She activated her own display, showing casualty statistics that painted a stark picture. The problem isn't just response time for emergencies. Human medical teams were also conducting regular health surveys, providing preventive care, and training local medics. Without those programs, we're seeing disease outbreaks that should never have started. Elena examined the data with professional interest. These are certainly concerning trends. Have council medical authorities developed alternative approaches? That's the problem, Dr. Ninero admitted. The alternative approaches all require the kind of initiative and independent decision-making that the compliance protocols prohibit. The economic coordinator was even more direct. Ambassador, the economic models are clear. If current trends continue for another 2 weeks, we'll see system-wide supply chain collapse. After a month, we're looking at famine on 43 worlds. She gestured to displays showing trade routes that were effectively shutting down across the galaxy. The issue isn't just that human merchants were willing to take risks. They were also willing to operate at a loss when necessary, to maintain supply lines to marginal colonies, and to adapt their routes based on changing conditions. Elena nodded thoughtfully. And council-approved merchants won't do those things. They can't, the coordinator explained. Their operating procedures require profit margins that make serving frontier colonies impossible. Their route planning protocols don't allow for the kind of adaptability that changing conditions require. Elena was beginning to understand the full scope of what the council was facing. It wasn't just that human compliance was causing problems. It was revealing how much of their civilization's functionality had depended on human noncompliance. Zelandra, The Veltheri representative spoke with tentacles that trembled with exhaustion. Ambassador, I need to ask you something directly. When humans were less compliant, did you understand how much the galactic community depended on your independent actions? It was a fascinating question, and Elena considered it carefully before answering. To some extent, yes. But I think we saw it differently than you did. How so? Humans tend to focus on immediate problems rather than systemic dependencies, Elena explained. When we saw pirates threatening shipping lanes, we responded to the immediate threat. We didn't necessarily think about how our response was compensating for gaps in official security coverage. She paused, organizing her thoughts. When our medics provided aid to frontier colonies, they were responding to people in need. They weren't consciously filling gaps in council medical services. But you were filling those gaps, Dr. Ninera pointed out. Yes, Elena agreed. But from a human perspective, we were just doing what needed to be done. It didn't occur to us that other species weren't doing the same things. Admiral Vorthake's compound eyes focused intently on Elena. Are you saying humans didn't realize how unique your approach was? Elena smiled slightly. Admiral, for most of human history, we assumed everyone thought like we did. When we joined the galactic community, we kept assuming that everyone would eventually start acting like humans if given enough time and example. The silence that followed was profound as the implications sank in. Humanity hadn't been deliberately positioning itself as indispensable. They had simply been acting according to their nature, assuming that other species would eventually adopt similar approaches. That explains a lot, the Granite Lord representative rumbled. Human diplomatic proposals always assumed other species would be willing to take initiatives that we would never consider. And human trade agreements were structured around the assumption that partners would be flexible about terms when circumstances changed, added the economic coordinator. Elena nodded. We thought we were teaching by example. We didn't realize we were compensating for fundamental differences in how our species approach problems. High Counselor Reshmerich had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. Ambassador, when the Council criticized human behavior as chaotic and disruptive, how did your people interpret that criticism? Elena's expression grew more serious. We interpreted it as a request to change. Humans are very responsive to feedback, especially from partners we respect. When you told us we were causing problems, we tried to fix them. By becoming more like us, observed the ethereal collective representative. By becoming more like what we thought you wanted us to be, Elena corrected. The problem is that what you said you wanted and what you actually needed were two different things. Admiral Vorthake leaned back in his chair, mandibles clicking slowly. You're saying we trained you to stop doing the things we depended on you to do. That's one way to look at it, Elena agreed. Another way is to say that you asked us to solve a problem you didn't understand. She gestured around the chamber. For decades, you've been trying to create a more orderly, predictable galactic community. You saw human behavior as an obstacle to that goal. But what you didn't realize was that human behavior was what made your orderly system actually work. The economic coordinator was reviewing data streams on her display. The economic models support this interpretation. Human economic behavior consistently violated efficiency principles in ways that improved overall system stability. Medical intervention patterns show the same trend, Dr. Ninera added. Human medical teams consistently acted in ways that prevented larger crises from developing. Admiral Vorthake was nodding slowly. And human military doctrine emphasizes preventing conflicts rather than winning them efficiently. Elena watched as the pieces clicked into place for each representative. They were finally understanding that humanity's chaotic behavior had been serving crucial system maintenance functions that no one else was equipped to handle. So the question becomes, Reshmerich said slowly, how do we move forward from here? Elena had been waiting for this moment. High Counselor, that depends on what the Council is willing to acknowledge, which is that human behavior that you previously characterized as problems were actually solutions to problems you didn't know you had. The chamber was quiet for a long moment as the representatives grappled with the implications. To accept Elena's characterization would require admitting that their fundamental understanding of proper governance had been flawed. And if we acknowledge this, asked the ethereal collective representative, then we can discuss how to move forward as partners rather than as supervisors and subordinates, Elena replied. Reshmerich looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each representative. The conversations of the past 12 hours had already prepared them for this moment, but it still required courage to take the final step. The Council acknowledges, he said formally, that previous characterizations of human behavioral patterns were incomplete and failed to account for their beneficial systemic effects. Elena nodded approvingly. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was a sufficient acknowledgement of error to build on. In that case, she said, humanity is prepared to discuss modifications to our current compliance protocols. The relief that swept through the chamber was almost palpable, but Elena wasn't finished. However, she continued, any such modifications must include formal recognition that human operational doctrine, while unconventional, serves essential functions within the galactic community. What does that mean in practical terms? Admiral Vorthake asked. Elena smiled, and, for the first time in days, it carried a hint of the warmth that had characterized human diplomacy before the crisis began. It means you stop trying to make us act like everyone else. It means when human teams respond to emergencies without authorization, you don't punish them for initiative. It means when human merchants bend trade rules to help struggling colonies, you don't call it chaos. She leaned forward slightly. Most importantly, it means you trust us to be human, even when being human means doing things that don't fit your procedures. And in return? Reshmerich asked. In return, you get partners who will keep your civilization running even when your own systems fail. Elena said simply. Partners who will take risks you can't take, make sacrifices you can't justify, and solve problems you don't even know you have. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. But you also get partners who will argue with you, question your decisions, and occasionally ignore your orders when they conflict with what needs to be done. Partners, the Granite Lord representative rumbled, not subordinates. Exactly, Elena confirmed. High Counselor Reshmerich looked around the chamber one final time. The choice was clear. They could maintain their authority and watch their civilization collapse, or they could share power with a species that seemed to understand something about governance that they had missed. The Council accepts these terms, he said finally. Elena's smile brightened considerably. Excellent. Then, let's discuss how to get everyone back to work. 6 months later, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood in the same grand assembly hall where humanity had shocked the galaxy with 2 simple words. But everything about the scene was different now. The chamber buzzed with active conversation, representatives moved freely between species delegations, and the atmosphere carried an energy that had been absent for years. Elena was reviewing reports on her data tablet when Admiral Vorthake approached, his insectoid features more relaxed than she had ever seen them. Ambassador, I wanted to thank you personally for the tactical consultation your people provided last week. Elena looked up with genuine interest. The Crimson Nebula situation? Completely resolved, the Admiral confirmed. Though I admit, the solution your Captain Morrison proposed violated approximately 47 different military protocols. Elena grinned. Captain Morrison is very good at finding creative solutions to impossible problems. I take it the approach was effective? The pirate fleet surrendered without firing a shot, Admiral Vorthake said, mandibles clicking with what Elena had learned to recognize as amusement. Apparently, they weren't prepared for a negotiating strategy that involved offering them legitimate employment in frontier security. Captain Morrison believes that most pirates are just entrepreneurs who've run out of legal options, Elena explained. Give them a better opportunity, and they'll usually take it. The Admiral shook his head in wonder. 6 months ago, I would have called that approach completely inappropriate. Now our recruitment numbers are up 30%, and the former pirates are some of our most effective frontier patrol teams. Elena nodded approvingly. It was one of dozens of similar success stories that had emerged as humanity had gradually returned to their normal operational patterns. The key difference was that now those patterns were officially recognized as valuable rather than disruptive. Dr. Ninera approached from across the chamber, her head tentacles carrying the relaxed posture that indicated contentment in her species. Ambassador Vasquez, I wanted to discuss the medical training exchange program. How are your people adapting to human emergency protocols? Elena asked. Better than expected, Dr. Ninera admitted. Though I confess, teaching other species to ignore proper procedures when lives are at stake has been challenging. Elena laughed. It's not about ignoring procedures. It's about understanding when procedures serve the goal and when they get in the way of it. Yes, that's exactly what your Dr. Chen keeps saying, Dr. Ninera agreed. The concept of situational protocol adaptation is becoming quite popular in our medical schools. Good, Elena said warmly. Though I suspect your medical schools will develop their own variations that we never would have thought of. It was true. One of the unexpected benefits of the new partnership approach was that other species were beginning to develop their own versions of human-style initiative. The results were often unique to their particular species characteristics, creating solutions that neither humans nor the original species could have developed alone. The economic coordinator materialized nearby, her aquatic breathing apparatus bubbling with excited activity. Ambassador, the Frontier Development Project results are remarkable. Elena had been looking forward to this report. Tell me. The combined approach is exceeding all projections, the coordinator explained enthusiastically. Human merchants establish initial trade routes and provide emergency support. Council financial systems provide stable long-term investment. The result is sustainable colony development that neither approach could achieve alone. She manipulated a holographic display showing economic activity in previously marginal sectors. Colony survival rates are up 200%, and development timelines have been cut in half. Elena studied the data with satisfaction. It represented exactly the kind of synergy that the original council structure had been intended to create but had never quite achieved. The combination of human initiative and alien systematic thinking was proving more effective than either approach in isolation. Zelandra approached the group, her tentacles carrying the patterns that indicated excitement in Veltheri body language. Ambassador, I have news about the Kepler mining operations. Good news, I hope? Elena asked. Production is at record levels, Zelandra confirmed. But that's not the interesting part. The human security teams and our mining engineers have developed a new extraction technique that's completely revolutionary. Elena raised an eyebrow. Revolutionary how? It combines human improvisation with our systematic approach to geological analysis, Zelandra explained. The humans keep finding ways to extract resources from formations that our computers say are impossible to mine. Our engineers then figure out how to replicate their improvised solutions systematically. She paused, tentacles curling with what Elena recognized as deep satisfaction. We're discovering resources in areas that we had written off as completely unviable. Elena felt a warm glow of pride. It was exactly the kind of collaborative innovation that she had always believed was possible between species, but which the previous rigid system had made difficult to achieve. High Counselor Reshmerik's voice carried clearly across the chamber as he called for attention. Representatives, if you would take your seats, we have several matters to address today. Elena noticed that the seating arrangement had evolved considerably from the original hierarchical structure. Species delegations still maintained their designated areas, but the barriers between sections had been removed, and representatives frequently moved between different areas during sessions. It created a much more dynamic and collaborative atmosphere. First, Reshmerik announced as the chamber settled, I'm pleased to report that the emergency protocols established 6 months ago have been so successful that the Council is voting to make them permanent. A ripple of approval went through the chamber. The emergency protocols were essentially formalized permission for species to act outside normal procedures when circumstances required it, with post-action review rather than pre-approval requirements. Second, Reshmerik continued, the cross-species cooperation initiatives have exceeded all expectations. We're seeing innovation rates that are unprecedented in Council history. Elena smiled at that. The cooperation initiatives were largely based on the human approach to problem-solving, putting together teams from different species and letting them figure out solutions without too much oversight. The results had been remarkable. Third, Reshmerik said, his 6 eyes focusing directly on Elena. The Council would like to discuss a proposal from the human delegation regarding expansion of the collaborative model. Elena stood smoothly, data tablet in hand. She had been working on this proposal for months, and she was excited to finally present it formally. High Counselor, members of the Council, she began. 6 months ago, we learned valuable lessons about the importance of diversity in operational approaches. Humans brought initiative and adaptability to problems that required those qualities. Other species brought systematic thinking and careful planning to problems that required those qualities. She activated a holographic display showing collaboration statistics from across the galaxy. But we've also discovered something more important. When different species work together on problems, they consistently develop solutions that none of them could have created independently. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Everyone had seen examples of this phenomenon over the past 6 months. Therefore, Elena continued, humanity proposes the establishment of permanent mixed species teams for all major council initiatives. Not just crisis response, but routine operations, long-term planning, and exploratory projects. Admiral Vorthake leaned forward with interest. What would this look like in practical terms? Rather than having separate human medical teams, Velthari engineering teams, and Saurian security teams, we would have mixed teams for each function, Elena explained. Human medics working with Velthari engineers and Saurian security specialists. Granite Lord planners working with human innovators and ethereal collective analysts. She gestured to the display, which now showed proposed team structures. Each team would combine the strongest capabilities of multiple species while maintaining enough operational independence to adapt to changing circumstances. Dr. Nineara was nodding enthusiastically. The medical applications alone would be revolutionary. Imagine combining human emergency improvisation with ethereal collective diagnostic precision and aquatic federation surgical techniques. The economic benefits would be substantial, added the economic coordinator. Mixed species teams could develop trade solutions that serve the needs of multiple species simultaneously. Elena could see the idea taking hold around the chamber. It represented a fundamental shift from the original council model, which had essentially been separate species working in parallel, toward true collaborative governance. There would be challenges, Elena admitted. Communication protocols, conflicting procedural requirements, cultural misunderstandings. Some teams would fail spectacularly, and some would succeed spectacularly, rumbled the Granite Lord representative. The question is whether we're willing to accept the failures in order to achieve the successes. It was, Elena realized, the same question the Council had faced 6 months ago when they decided whether to trust humanity's chaotic approach to problem-solving. The difference was that now they had evidence that diversity of approach led to better outcomes, even when some of those approaches seemed wrong to outside observers. High Counselor Reshmerick looked around the chamber, gauging the mood of the assembled representatives. This proposal would represent a significant change to fundamental council operations. Yes, Elena agreed. But 6 months ago, we learned that our fundamental operations weren't working as well as we thought they were. The counselor's 6 eyes focused on Elena with an expression she had learned to interpret as thoughtful consideration. Ambassador, you're asking us to institutionalize the very chaos that we originally tried to eliminate. Elena's smile was warm and confident. High Counselor, I'm asking you to institutionalize the diversity that makes our galactic community strong. The chaos is just what it looks like from the outside. She gestured around the chamber, which was now buzzing with quiet conversations as representatives discussed the proposal among themselves. Look around this room. 6 months ago, we were all sitting in rigid formations, following strict protocols, and steadily becoming less effective at solving problems. And now? Reshmerick asked. Now we're talking to each other, learning from each other, and developing solutions that none of us could have imagined alone, Elena said simply. It looks chaotic because we're all different. But those differences are what make us stronger together than we could ever be separately. The silence that followed was contemplative rather than tense. Around the chamber, Elena could see representatives of dozens of species considering the proposal not just as a policy change, but as a fundamental evolution in how they thought about galactic governance. Finally, the ethereal collective representative pulsed with colors that indicated deep contemplation. Ambassador Vasquez, 6 months ago humanity taught us that sometimes the most dangerous response isn't defiance, it's agreement. Elena nodded, remembering that day clearly. That's true. Today, you're teaching us something else, the representative continued. that sometimes the most productive response isn't conformity, it's collaboration. Also true, Elena agreed. Very well, High Counselor Reshmarik announced, his voice carrying the formal tone of official council business. The council will vote on the mixed species team proposal. All in favor. Elena watched as, one by one, every species delegation indicated their approval. It wasn't unanimous. There were several abstentions and at least 2 negative votes, but it was enough. The proposal passes, Reshmarik declared. Implementation will begin immediately. As the session ended and representatives began moving around the chamber, Elena felt a deep sense of satisfaction. 6 months ago, when she had walked into this same chamber and said, "Fine, we accept," she had been issuing a challenge wrapped in compliance. Today, she was seeing the fruits of that challenge in the form of a galactic community that was stronger, more innovative, and more resilient than it had ever been before. Admiral Vorth AK approached her with his characteristic clicking mandibles. "Ambassador, I have to ask. When you said, 'Fine, we accept' 6 months ago, did you know this is how it would end?" Elena considered the question carefully. "I knew it couldn't end with humanity being permanently subordinate. And I knew that the council would eventually realize that they needed what they were trying to eliminate. But you didn't know exactly how it would work out." Elena's smile was bright and genuine. "Admiral, if I had known exactly how it would work out, it wouldn't have been a very human solution, would it?" The Admiral's mandibles clicked with laughter. "No, Ambassador. I suppose it wouldn't have been." As Elena gathered her things and prepared to leave the chamber, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Humanity had learned that sometimes the best way to prove your value was to demonstrate what happened when that value was absent. The galactic community had learned that diversity of approach, even when it looked like chaos, was essential for addressing the unexpected challenges of governing across hundreds of worlds and dozens of species. Most importantly, they had all learned that true partnership required accepting each other's differences rather than trying to eliminate them. Elena's final thought as she left the Grand Assembly Hall was simple but profound. When humans say, "Fine, we accept," the galaxy freezes, but only long enough to realize that what they thought they wanted and what they actually needed were two completely different things.